Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming to today's class. Happy Wednesday on A Jewish Trinity, Contemporary Christian Theology Through Jewish Eyes with Rabbi Dr. Alan Brill. Rabbi Dr. Alan Brill is a Cooperman and Ross Chair for the Jewish Christian Studies at Seton Hall University. Brill is an expert on Jewish thought and interfaith relations. He is the author of many books, including Judaism and World Religions, Christianity, Islam, and Eastern Religions. In 2012, Judaism and Other Religions, Models of Understanding in 2010. He received a Fulbright Senior Scholar Award at Banaras Hindu University in Varanasi, Uttar Pradesh, India. He was a keynote speaker at the R20 conference held in Indonesia. This research he produced recent volume, Rabbi on the Ganges, A Jewish Hindu Encounter in 2019. His recently published book is A Jewish Trinity, Contemporary Christian Theology Through Jewish Eyes this year. Welcome, Dr. Brill.
Thank you. Okay, so this is coming from my book that just came out last month, A Jewish Trinity, Contemporary Jewish Thought, Contemporary Christian Thought Through Jewish Eyes. So today I'm going to talk about a topic that Jews usually or never speak about, which is the Trinity. Jews have generally seen the Trinity as inscrutable or tri-theism in past polemical ages. But now in a post-polemical age, does the Trinity still resonate in the same negative way? I'm going to start with a story. I was in Rome for an anniversary of Nostra Aetate, and among the many delegate speakers was a priest who was proud to tell me that he studied Jewish studies at Hebrew University. At one point in the course of the week, I was standing with my wife in front of Il Gesù Church in Rome, and he walked up to us and declaratively, "Can't you feel the Shekhinah here?" Now, my wife and I looked at each other at this priest using a rabbinic Hebrew phrase that he thought brought us together. But for him, the Shekhinah was the presence of the Trinity. And for us, on some level, it's a free-floating rabbinic and Kabbalistic word. Not the same as he used it. For him, the Shekhinah was the second person of the Trinity. And for us, it's just a metaphor for God's presence. But the important thing to understand is that we're coming from a similar spiritual neighborhood. Meaning, one of these, really clean ones is when it says in Mishnah Tractate Avot 3:2, but two people who are studying together and their words of Torah is spoken between them, the divine presence, the Shekhinah, rests between them. In a very similar manner, in Matthew, in the New Testament, 18:20, where there are two or three gathered together in my name, I am present in the midst of them. We take the divine presence to mean something different, but at the same time, we're coming from the same spiritual neighborhood, with the same formulations, the same texts, and even when we diverge, if you're not looking to blow it up, you'll see a certain commonality within it. So let's get started. Now, I've been thinking about this topic for a long time. I went to Fordham University, a Catholic Jesuit university, where I obtained a doctorate in Catholic theology, and I learned Catholic theology firsthand. At this point, I can help Catholics catch up to what the Trinity means, or what Christology is, or what their soteriology is. For me, it's not foreign turf. It's something that I understand well. I teach in a New Jersey Catholic college, so I understand how to speak to Catholics. And the original obstacles for a Jewish-Christian encounter is not the same when you teach in a Jewish Christian studies program in a Catholic university, My students are all priests who want to know about Judaism. They take courses in Hebrew and Holocaust and Talmud. It's not that we're speaking two completely foreign languages at this point. And on top of it, we do theology in the presence of the other. Christians go and study under Jewish instructors, and Christians are studying under Jewish instructors. We are not foreign and separate from each other like we once were. Now, I also coming to this from a new method called comparative theology, where you're not asking who's right or who's wrong, but you're asking in a way of faith-seeking understanding, meaning my coming from my committed Jewish faith, and therefore my goal is to say, what does the other religion mean to me, looking at it with Jewish eyes? And therefore you live in a tension between same and difference, between interconnection and distinctiveness, and understanding that. Now, this method was originally developed for Christians to look at Buddhism, for Christians to look at Islam. Surprisingly, even though my degree is in Catholic theology, I turned to this only after spending time in India. Because if I came back explaining to everyone Hindu theology in Jewish terms, oh, you know, this Hindu emanation scheme, or this Hindu view of how God connects to the world, this means this within Jewish terms. If I could do that between Judaism and Hinduism that do not have a direct historic connection of text, it opens up a new vista to comparing to Christianity, in which there are points of connection. Now, first of all, currently, both Jewish and Christian scholars, both historians and theologians, acknowledge we have a common spiritual neighborhood of Second Temple Judaism and early centuries. That's an important point. After the Qumran writings, after looking at early texts of the early centuries, after looking at Midrash, after looking at patristics, both sides have independently said we come from the same spiritual neighborhood, and you will find parallels and resonances between almost everything in Jewish and Christian thought in the early centuries, but both religions made very, very different directions, turns, and constructions from the material. To see this common neighborhood, you do have to acknowledge that Judaism includes the Midrashic writings. You can't say, oh, that's Midrash and I don't care. It's assuming that Jews and Christians share apocalyptic writings. It assumes we share many of the same angelic writings and writings of Second Temple literature. And that if you have the full gamut of Jewish texts and Christian texts, the full range of divinity, it looks different than already starting with 19th or 20th century conclusions. So in many ways, the bridging of Judaism and Christianity is standing on the shoulders of Second Temple scholars like James Kugel, who brought back many of the Second Temple writings into discussion, or Daniel Boyarin, or Michael Fishbane, or many of these others who made us look back at Midrashic writings. And on the Christian side, it's not starting with what Christianity became. It's starting with the first 4 centuries, in which many of the early church fathers have positions much closer to rabbinic Judaism than what Christianity eventually chose. And from these common horizons, we chose different directions. Before I get to contemporary theology, I must point out some differences that came to be in the first 4 centuries. This is where we diverged already in the first 4 centuries. First of all, and this is going to be a little bit, I'm going to use some sort of big words that are known from Christian heresies. I will explain all of them. The first one is that Judaism is monarchist. Judaism is a hierarchy. When we say the Shekhinah is not the same as the unknown divine. We say the Shekhinah is the part of the divine with us, as opposed to some unknown divine that's higher and unscrutable. For Christians, they are explicitly anti-monarchist, and they believe all parts of the divine, the infinite, the manifest, and the divine here in our fellowship on earth, all have to be connected to one another. They have a fancy word for it called perichoresis. Don't worry about the word. But the important part is if we say the Shekhinah is at our table when we eat, or the Shekhinah is with us when we are studying Torah, we don't take that to be the infinite unknown divine. They, by definition, say all parts have to be interrelated. They can't break off any part and consider it separate. 2, modalism, another fancy word, but our philosophers actually use that. Where our philosophers, including Maimonideans, can say, look, God has many modes, God has many attributes, there are many ways of looking at God, and they're modes, they're attributes. Christianity decided that modalism is not correct, and instead these are all separate persons. And that's a really big difference as it plays out over history. Another distinction is Paula Fredrickson, Jewish scholar of late antiquity, points out that already in the Greco-Roman world, the first centuries, almost all pagans acknowledged the theos, acknowledged the one God of the Bible or in just the philosophy. Not like we once thought they were all running around, well, polytheists or whatever. No, the idea that everybody believed in a theos, in a one God behind everything. But for most pagans, the one God behind everything, like the Aristotelian, the Platonic, or distant Zeus, was not the God who took care of us, was not the God who healed the sick, was not the God who clothed the naked, and therefore you needed a lower manifestation, a lower divine to take care of us. And that's common in many of the world's religions, that the one you now pray for the sick is not the same as the highest divine. Jews, on the other hand, said, our God of the Bible who took us out from Egypt and clothes the naked, heals the sick, hears our prayers, is the same God as the high God. That becomes an immediate distinction, is that they are compelled, leaving out the Jesus story, they are compelled to have a second person of the Trinity, whether they like it or not. They need a lower divine to hear prayers the way Jews do not. Okay? It's an important point just to think about that for a moment. If you believe that divine was really inaccessible, then who do you offer up your thanks? Who do you put votives on the lawn to when you get better? You needed a lower form of deity, and that's where the divine became separate. And so if we look at the Middle Ages, I'm going to do this quickly just because most of you are not experts in the Middle Ages. In the 13th century, Nachmanides, in his disputation with Pablo Cristiani, who was trying to force him on the truth of Christianity, wrote as follows: Frau Pablo asked me in Gerona whether I believe in the Trinity. I said to him, what is the Trinity? He said, wisdom, will, and power. Then I said, rather, he and his wisdom are one, he and his will are one, he and his power are one. If so, wisdom, will, and power are one. Even if God had accidental qualities, they would not be a trinity, but they would just be three modes. So Nachmanides gave a modal understanding of the Trinity, but that's not what Christians really believe. They believe in three persons. But Jews, when they looked at it, even in the Middle Ages, understood it in these terms that they just were attributes. And even Maimonideans like Isaac Abelard said very clearly, if the Christians were to frame this as modes of God, I would have no problem as a Maimonidean saying God has different modes. Because God does have different modes. If God has the different modes, then that's part of a natural way God should be. Okay, when we turn to the 19th century, I'll ask questions, take all the questions at the end. In the 19th century, under the anti-Judaism of the 19th century, Judaism was painted as the opposite of Christianity. Christianity was seen as having Greco-Roman roots, as having a common spiritual neighborhood with paganism, and that was something they were proud of. They were not Jewish, and that Jesus was not a Judean. He was rejecting everything that's Judaic. No one holds that anymore, but that's what they thought in the 19th century, most famously Harnack. And at the same time, Judaism returned the compliment by saying Judaism is pure ethical monotheism compared to Christianity's paganism. And as late as 1943, Trudy Weiss Rosmarin wrote her classic Judaism and Christianity, The Differences, setting out that on a congregational level, that the two religions are fundamentally opposed with nothing in common, that one of them has a ethical monotheism and the other is a tritheism. Now my point to this paper. In the 20th century, there was a convergence of thought. Contemporary Christians post-World War II do not speak Neoplatonism. I cannot find anyone at Seton Hall or Fordham or Notre Dame that still see the Trinity in Neoplatonic terms of the 4th century. The same way Judaism is not the 4th century and not some obscure Kabbalist, they are not their medieval formulations anymore, even in official versions. The most important one to look at is going to be Karl Rahner, who died in 1984, who was one of the official theologians of Vatican II. And he's one of the foremost Roman Catholic theologians of the second half of the 20th century, and he was friends with Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel. They found a lot of commonality in their common existentialism. Now, Rahner affirms, now listen to this, there are no three persons of the Trinity, but there are three volitions, all in one essence. 2, the distinctions in the Trinity are relative, not absolute. 3, the three parts do not have separate consciousness or personhood. Now, if he's saying, Karl Barth, the Protestant, has very similar ideas. If we no longer have three persons, three consciousnesses, and they're all one essence, not three parts, is that very much different than what Nachmanides or Isaac Abelard said? If you were just dealing with attributes, then I'd have no problem accepting it. Now, traditional Catholic theologians may claim Rahner was weak on the role of the persons of the Trinity, but from a Jewish point of view, that makes him very close to the modalist position, meaning Rahner doesn't actually want to be a modalist because that's seen as something you don't want to be, but from a Jewish point of view, it's close enough. Rahner rejects the position that the persons of the Trinity are just masks, meaning that they're just different ways God appears to the world. But the idea that the parts of the divine are only masks is an acceptable Jewish position. For Judaism, the interdivine structures are on some level mere masks and never have their own volition. While for Christianity, even in Rahner's version, they have to have equal status with the Father. Different theologies, but able to be understood with each other. So let me repeat that. Where we say God as judgment or God as mercy, we have no problem saying that's metaphor, it's an attribute, it's a mask. Rahner is telling you that when we say God is showing mercy over judgment, in some way it's expressing the infinite of the divine. That's our major difference at this point in the 21st century when we look at a Catholic theologian like Rahner. At this point, all the original Jewish objections of having three persons or perichoresis have kind of fallen away, and we have just the question of how does the modes work? Are the modes mere masks or names? Or for the Christian, do they have to contain all? Does it have to be all of it manifest as once? But there's not enough for a Jewish position to actually crawl in that space and say that's problematic. Because I can find enough Hasidic thought that would say when we see God's mercy, that's really God's infinite nature. That's not really enough for us to find that problematic anymore. Times have changed. The second major theologian I want to consider who has changed the thinking is Jürgen Moltmann. Jürgen Moltmann was one of the most widely read theologians in the second half of the 20th century. He passed away, was it a little over a year ago? And he consciously writes as a post-Holocaust Christian theologian. Know that at this point, Jürgen Moltmann, Cardinal Casper, most of the contemporary Christian thinkers, part of their own acts of reconciliation of Vatican II, are consciously writing as post-Holocaust theologians. And Moltmann's doctrine of God starts with the suffering of life that we all experience as evidenced through the Holocaust. And with the fact that there's a divine plurality because we see God acting differently in the world. Now, what makes Moltmann very different than Rahner is Moltmann will start his position by quoting Elie Wiesel and quoting Abraham Joshua Heschel and quoting Franz Rosenzweig. He's going to take the Jewish ideas of suffering, of Holocaust, of God, the Shekhinah going into exile with the Jewish people, and he's going to consciously say, yes, we come from the same spiritual neighborhood, even if we reach different conclusions. Moltmann asserts that the very Christian ideas of the incarnation of the Logos and the indwelling of the Holy Spirit are the same ideas as the Jewish ideas of the Shekhinah going into exile or the Shekhinah being with us. The very thing I quoted from you comparing a vote to Matthew, he's going to start and say, yes, of course we're from the same spiritual neighborhood. Moltmann will be very explicit that all that Greek philosophy of Neoplatonism is not where we are at the end of the 20th century. We want to go back to our Hebraic roots. And we're going to want to use biblical language. We're not going to go using the Neoplatonic language that Christians don't speak anymore. Moltmann is going to write explicitly that the New Testament shows that the Israelite theology of the Shekhinah, of God who lives in heaven and also among the wretched of his people, reveals a double presence, meaning a God in heaven and a God suffering with us here on earth. And he's going to quote Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel for God's bipolarity. That God has that unknown aspect, and God at the same time is the most moved mover, suffering with us. However, Moltmann will then say, whereas Jewish understanding has a double presence, Christian experience has a triple presence. For Moltmann, the people experience exile and persecution, and the Shekhinah suffers with them. And the Shekhinah suffers exile, and the people share their suffering with the Shekhinah. Moltmann asserts, and he writes, I quote, Abraham Heschel has shown that the Jewish experience of God cannot be a simple monotheism based on the basis of the experience of the divine pathos. It must come to be a self-aware self-distinction of God. Every self-communication presumes a self-distinction. Whoever speaks of the communication of God presumes a relationship in which God can step over God. Now, I must point out, with my Jewish eyes, we're still going to write it up as some sort of hierarchy. We would never think that the Shekhinah in exile with us is the Shekhinah in heaven. Is the God in heaven. But he's going to keep that Trinitarian thought that it's all that his, what he's going to call Heschel's bipolarity, which he wants to make a tripolarity, is all one. And even Heschel will leave it as two different stages. That's part one of Moltmann. Moltmann, too, spent a lot of time reading Gershon Shalom. And Moltmann thinks that the Lurianic Kabbalistic idea of the Tzimtzum, God's contraction, as presented by Gershon Shalom, is one of the best understandings of a theistic God. We don't like that abstract, perfect, medieval Platonic God anymore. But the idea that God had to contract himself, limit himself, makes sense. That God had to release a certain section of his being from which he has withdrawn, a kind of primal space, and into this accordingly he can then issue himself in creation and revelation. Tzimtzum, God's contraction to Moltmann, means, and this is where he crosses out of our language, incarnation and kenosis, the self-emptying, which Moltmann identifies with the Shekhinah. And this is where it becomes his tripolarity, that after the Shekhinah, after the Tzimtzum, where Jews will then talk about the emanation of light, and that there's light everywhere, and that we're going to find divine light in all things. He is going to instead go back to the Christian language of saying that it's kenosis, Christ self-emptying, and it's the incarnation in our world. But for Jews, Tzimtzum doesn't mean the Shekhinah. Tzimtzum is a hollow, an absence of God. For Jewish thought, there always remains a hierarchy, a gap, and a phora, something that then has to be filled with the divine light. For Jews, the divine glory and the Shekhinah accompanying Israel in the desert are a created lower level, existing in a hierarchy with an unknown divine. For Moltmann, it is the second person of the Trinity. For the Shekhinah tradition of the Jews helps Moltmann arrive at a divine unity with a theological concept of mutual indwelling, the Christian perichoresis. But Jews don't have an indwelling. We have a tzimtzum, we have a divine light, we've got a shvira, we've got a cosmic break, we then have a reconstruction of it, a tikkun, and then gathering sparks. He's taking certain Jewish metaphors and applying them to the Trinity. And Moltmann tries to close the gap between Judaism and Christianity, and we must give him credit. He certainly does, because as he shows in late antiquity, we were using the same language, and now once again in the world of Heschel, Shalom, Elie Wiesel, we're once again using the same language, even if we do different things with it. Now for the major point of my paper. Modern Christian theology, and especially in its Catholic and High Church, Lutheran, and Anglican forms, has moved beyond Augustine, has moved beyond Neoplatonism. It is not what people show up in their catechism classes and learn anymore. They are learning Rahner or Moltmann, or even more radical things like Elizabeth Johnson. The textbook understands that Christianity that Jews know are frozen in medieval scholasticism. Jews should not assume that Christians are still the 13th or 12th century versions of their faith, nor the same way you're not going to assume Judaism is not some 12th century Kabbalistic or any other 12th century version of what it is. Modern Jews are speaking modern Jewish thought, whether you are reading Heschel or Elie Wiesel or Rosenzweig or Rabbi Yitzhak Greenberg. I don't care what you're reading, but it's not going to be a treatise on medieval theology. So too Christians are not getting up there and reading that in their required courses in Christianity. New theologians, whether Rahner, Balthasar, Moltmann, Casper, David Tracy, Elizabeth Johnson, are in a very different space. When I look at these contemporary theologians, I can understand them in Jewish terms in a way that I couldn't understand the Augustinian Trinity or the Augustinian terms. After Hegel and Kant, after existentialism, after hermeneutics, after the social sciences of sociology and psychology, we read the same books, we have the same ideas, we converge, we go to the same graduate schools at Harvard and Chicago and Duke. We are now speaking the same languages. A modal Trinitarian position such as Rahner's is less different than a philosophic understanding of Judaism, and that even many of Maimonidean, like Albalag, could be quite comfortable with Rahner, while Moltmann's Trinitarian position of contraction of kenosis would resonate with any modern Jewish thinker that is using Kabbalistic metaphors in the same free way. I can go further at this and push it home. The same thing is true even if we look at things like incarnation or original sin. Once again, these modern Christian thinkers all want to say incarnation is an outgrowth of our same spiritual neighborhood of Second Temple thinking, in which God indwells in the tabernacle and then indwells in the temple. If you read the Midrash, if you read the rabbinic writings on the tabernacle, God flows in like an ocean, but the ocean is not minimized. There's a real sense of presence, of coming on earth, and that we're coming from that same God's presence incarnational language. The only thing is Christians are now applying it to a very specific person in the first century. The Jews have no connection to whatsoever. We are also coming from a similar tradition of Second Temple humans who ascend to heaven and divine that comes down to earth. If you read books like the Book of Daniel or the very influential books of Jubilees or books of Enoch, which we've all learned to read anew with Midrash scholars like James Kugel, showing how much they play a role in our traditions, you see that people are coming and going between heaven, and we're coming from the same neighborhood. But Kabbalistic scholar Moshe Idel points out, and he wrote a big book, a 600-page book called Sonship, that Jews have an idea of the Son of God and incarnation. He wrote this for 600 pages with nothing to do with Christianity. No influence, no overlap. Entirely because we're coming from the same spiritual neighborhood. And that if we're talking about incarnation, the Christian version is talking about one very specific person who is seen as in some way a redeemer of the world, who redeems the world from original sin and then offers salvation. If that's what you're talking about, Jews and Christians have nothing in common. But if you're talking about the fact that God is incarnate on earth, that God has a presence coming out of the biblical traditions of the tabernacle and the temple and all sorts of other places that God appears, that we do have an overlap. What we don't have is this messianic figure who then offers redemption from original sin. But the incarnation thinking, we've got a lot in common. So much so that Jewish thinkers like Michael Wishgrad, Pinchas Lapid, French Jewish thinker André Nahar, all thought that Judaism could accommodate forms of incarnation as biblical and rabbinic. Our differing point is over why are you bringing in this first century person, and why do you think why do you believe in original sin, and why is he redeeming you from it? But incarnation is not the issue. The same way Trinity is not really our issue, incarnation is not really the issue. And now both Rahner and Moltmann both assume that God indwells in our reality in ways that are not Neoplatonic. But more excitingly, giving you a contemporary woman thinker, Elizabeth Johnson of Fordham University, she wrote a book openly rejecting the Ansam Augustinian approach to incarnation and says that incarnation happened at creation. God indwells in the act of creation, providing original blessing to the world, making our lives full, taking Jews out of Egypt, providing us our guidance, showing us a way. And the Jesus story is not where incarnation came in. I mean, I was just on a panel at a religion conference that even we now have evangelicals like Edwin Vindrail, who also are now believing in this original incarnation at the time of creation, that it's not that incarnation happened because of the Jesus story. That would not make sense of the Hebrew Bible. The Hebrew Bible is God saw the world and it was good, and God now is with us. That is the current turn. So I'm talking about contemporary Christian thought. Even the evangelicals are beginning to make this turn. That Elizabeth Johnson shows that the world was good at creation. God saw it was good. God acts in creation. God acts in Egypt. God dwells in the temple. We're going to choose good because God and his goodness is already indwelling in all creation, and all creation is part of God's indwelling. At this point, we've got a very strong convergence. I'm not going to overplay it, but even if we're going to deal with Elizabeth Johnson also points out how in the book of Genesis, God is immanent in the world. And in the book of Exodus, God becomes transcendent and becomes the lawgiver, but God remains immanent in the tabernacle. It just so happens that 20th century Orthodox Jewish thinker Rabbi Joseph B. Soloveitchik says the exact same thing in his commentaries on the Bible, that God is immanent in Genesis and transcendent as lawgiver in Exodus. Yes, we've got differences in how we view it, but the convergence lets us now sit around and actually talk about it and think about it in common structural terms. Now, there still remains the differences. Both are talking about God as immanent and God as transcendent. Both religions now have multiple manifestations or existences of God. But how do you explain it? One explains it using Trinitarian thinking, and the other one says one God is various modes, various attributes, various understandings. When we say God is immanent and transcendent, we don't have to break it into a Trinity. And Christians do, but we already see where the dividing line is. It's not inscrutable. It's not unknowable. Jews remain these aspects within a hierarchy, and Christians will not. So now, after the 20th century, Catholic thinker Karl Rahner, who defined the Trinity as three self-existences of the divine, a Jewish thinker could say, look, Soloveitchik's ideas of immanence and transcendence are not very much different than your self-existences of the divine. God is immanent, God is transcendent. We have a convergence. Let me now look at some conclusions. We remain different theologically and religiously. Most notably, we are theologically different. Our prayers are different. Historically, we are different. And we have a different sense of lived religion. Judaism does not have a Trinity or an incarnation via Christ, or an original sin that needs salvation. And one can look with a sense of contemporary theology as a Jew, seeking understanding of Christianity, a faith-seeking understanding, and make sense of these Christian ideas in Jewish terms. We started from a same spiritual neighborhood. We diverged from late antiquity through the Middle Ages into the early modern period, and in the late 20th century and the 21st century, we are converging again. We now teach in each other's graduate programs. Almost every Christian graduate program has Jews on the faculty at this point, and Christians study Jewish texts, and Jews who are going to these programs have studied Christian texts. We have learned to understand one another, but without eliding differences. For Christians, the Trinity remains a fixed theological view of God, affirmed in creed and liturgy. However, the whole rainbow, the whole spectrum of Jewish experiences and descriptions of God for Jews remains just a gallery of verbal images, none of which have ever become stone-hard concepts. You can be a Jew and say, I don't like Kabbalah, or I don't like Midrash, or I'm not going to deal with that piece of Talmud, in a way that Christians can't, because they've got to get up there and say, I affirm the creed. But the spectrum allows us now to understand how they understand it in the 21st century. Yet, rather than a Jewish monotheism, or even worse, the ethical monotheism of the 19th century versus a Christian tritheism, after Rahner, Moltmann, Elizabeth Johnson, and other contemporary Christian thinkers, we have a debate over the volition and structure of interdivine structures. The comparison is now a much narrower range. It's not a black and white dichotomy of same and difference. So in short, Jews and Christians made different decisions in the 3rd and 4th centuries that underlie today's differences, as well as today's newfound convergences. The goal of contemporary theology is to be able to look at the 20th and 21st centuries and see that we are once again dealing with many of the same issues. However, I am certainly not looking to create a Jewish theology of Christianity. I'm not looking to create a common theology, a shared mission, a partnership, or an ironic convergence. I'm not looking to create a universal idea or even anything we share. My goal is to act as a reader of texts and ideas in comparison, to basically show that contemporary Jewish and Christian theology are not the stereotype of diametrically opposed religious ideas they are portrayed to be. I'm specifically leaving out those Jewish and Christian thinkers who want to create a common Jewish Judeo-Christian theology. I'm not going there. My openness is very clear. I want to be able to still explain the dividing lines in an age of openness. During polemical ages, we made even the most minor difference into a chasm. Minor variances were treated as undefeatable bridges. My approach says in many places our distinctions are not much more different than a Jewish philosopher and a Jewish Kabbalist, a Jewish reader of Midrash, and a modern Jewish thinker. Second, to explain to Jews why Christian theology is not inscrutable, and to Christians how Jews have a very different theology. And third, to show the unacknowledged deep convergences in theology in the last half of the 20th century. Because our theologies emerge from mutual experience and mutual exposure to modern life. But they remain irreconcilable differences despite the changes. Finally, to engage in interfaith work or comparative theology or do anything that I'm talking about, you have to engage in hospitality. There has to be a hospitality of more than just a one-time meeting with the other side or already projecting that you know what the other side thinks without actually meeting them. You actually have to have an openness to the other side to let theology come to be. You have to listen to the other side without preconceived notions. You have to have a hospitality for you to go out of your own comfort zone and actually accept their hospitality and be humbled, to be surprised. You've got to have a Jewish faith that invites further conversation, humility, listening, and mutual respect. And we've got to be able to expose ourselves to moods, sensibilities, and attitudes which we otherwise wouldn't understand. When one crosses over to the religious life of another religious believer and learns the truths that animate what the others believe, the study also means coming back to Judaism and asking new questions about Judaism, its historic choices, and its contemporary options. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Bill, for this very in-depth discussion, as there's so much to unpack. So now we have some time to answer any questions or comments anyone has. So feel free to unmute.
I know there's a whole bunch that were in the chat while I was speaking. I'll take them in order. One, if Christianity is a opposed modality, different aspects of one God, how do they say the Trinity is triune one? Because of this concept, three is one is three, the perichoresis. The original Augustinian formulation is that there's a oneness of the divine, but there are three aspects to it that are not mere modes, but are all interdwelling with one another. Isn't bipolarity of God for Heschel immanence and transcendence? In Torah Min HaShamayim, Heschel talks about two aspects of God, which he associates with the school of Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Yishmael. So Heschel will go in more than one place about how the bipolarity works. In some of his earlier works, like Man is Not Alone, it will be much closer to God as the most moved sufferer with us, which is beyond just immanence. God is the God of pathos, that we have sympathy for the divine, which has incredible Christian resonance, as already Heschel was critiqued by Rabbi Eliezer Berkowitz like 65 years ago, for this sounded a little bit too much like a suffering servant aspect of God within Heschel. Moltmann picked that up right from the start in the 1960s when he read Heschel, as did several other American Christian thinkers. And remember that Heschel gave many of his lectures at the Christian Union Theological Seminary, which is already where this crossing over of language starts coming to be. But it's not just a sense of immanence that God is with us at the table. For Heschel was really much God is the most moved mover who's got pathos for our situation. Okay, what else is in here? Okay, next is Rabbi Yankelowitz pointing out that there's a discount 30% off code for my book, and you can buy my book at Fortress Press. It came out last month. And then we've got a thank you. Any other questions?
No, thank you so
Yes,
much.
Steve.
Sorry.
Oh, we've got two Steves here. Yes, Steve Morgan.
Yeah. How do you spell Moltmann's name?
Moltmann.
Oh, Moltmann. Okay. Jorgen and Karl Barth and Ronan. How do you spell Ronan's name?
Okay. Karl Barth, Barth. He didn't develop this as much, but he definitely does not hold three persons anymore. The one to look at, the thing is, Karl Rahner, Rahner, wrote a book called On the Trinity, but it was written in such a Germanic language that it's unreadable in almost any language unless you're a professional. And I don't mean that to turn you off from reading Rahner. The point is he gave lectures only the way somebody who is thinking in Latin and writing in German could write them in a way. You can get summaries out there of their positions. I hate to do this, but ChatGPT could give you a great summary of Karl Rahner on the Trinity, better than Karl Rahner could, because he's, Moltmann reads very well. Moltmann is a clear stylist. Okay. And Moltmann deals with almost every topic in contemporary theology, and almost everybody has been influenced by him.
Okay.
The other person who I didn't go into because he's just not as clean is Cardinal Walter Kasper. Cardinal Walter Kasper is like the leading Holy See Vatican theologian of Judaism. He wrote the recent document, The Gifts and the Calling are not revoked. He is the one writing the Catholic positions right now on Judaism, but because he's got to both write in his own name and in the name of the Holy See, it's a little bit different picking him out. But currently, as of 2015, Rahner has already said, Jews are saved, and there's a parallel between Torah and Christ. Jews believe Torah is eternal and pre-existing, and that your life is around Torah. Parallel to that, Christians believe Christ is pre-existing and eternal, and religious life is about Christ. He sets it up as a parallelism of a two-track system. And that's, you're going to find the current position, the official position of the Holy See is going to be always some version of that right now. And that's very far from anything we would have even heard 25 years ago. That document came out in 2015. It's called The Gifts and the Calling Are Not Revoked. There's then the two responses. There's then responses to it in 2017. Believe it or not, there was a joint statement of the chief rabbinate of Israel, the European Orthodox rabbis, together with the RCA, all acknowledging finally that the Catholics are not trying to convert us, and we can share common goals, and that we're going to work together for the benefit of the world. And as a response to that document,
What was the name of that? What was the name of that document?
Jerusalem and Rome. It was okay, so that was a camel because getting that many rabbis to agree to everything, you can see that they kept on changing it as they're going along. There's a letter that went to it with Rabbi R.A. Folger, who was the author of it, explaining why he did it and how difficult it was getting everyone to sign off on it. But it's really changed. It's really changed the field in the last decade, and so therefore almost everything coming out now is in a very, very different space, especially because the Vatican documents, meaning the gifts and the calling from 2015, were done with consultation with Professor Lawrence Schiffman, Professor Daniel Boyarin, meaning they asked the Jews, what do you think? And that produces something very different. And now there's always, at the Vatican, both Gregorian and Angelicum, there are always Jewish professors teaching advanced courses in Judaism, Talmud, Midrash, Kabbalah, Hasidism, modern Jewish thought, post-Holocaust thought. And so therefore the new generation is quite informed about Judaism, even at the Vatican levels. Now our goal is to make sure they all get good jobs so that they can have an influence.
Does Philip Cunningham, have you read any of his work? I was very impressed with his story of Shalom and teaching Shalom. And
yes. So that's going to take us to Shalom, which was the era of John Paul II. Okay? Meaning Nostra Aetate, I see your hands up, Steve, I'll get to you in a minute. Nostra Aetate only said the Jews are, Christianity grafted onto Judaism. Judaism's not to be rejected, and the blood deicide is not true, and anti-Semitism would be condemned. It took until John Paul II to acknowledge that Judaism is a living religion, to acknowledge the Holocaust, and to acknowledge the state of Israel. That's the era of Phil Cunningham and company, of Shalom. We are finally going to be brothers who are going to learn that Christianity or Catholicism can acknowledge Judaism is a living religion, and we can be brothers. It's a very different that we're now in a stage in 2025 where now you have to figure out, what does that mean? What's the relationship? How do we go forward without offending one side or the other in any formulation of it? And so that's the new generation coming forward.
If you mentioned this, I apologize, but could you explain again what Christians mean by God existing in three persons?
In the 21st century or in the 4th century?
Both.
So originally, it meant, originally it was taken to me that there are three persons of God, like we can think of an abstract God, a incarnate Christ God, and a Shekhinah God, and all three are three separate persons, and that we treat them as three personal aspects. Okay? That's the way most medieval Christians took it to mean. We come to the 20th century and we say, look, they can't all be psychoanalyzed as three persons. They don't have three pasts. They don't have three psyches. They don't have three consciousness. We can't make three different levels of AI. There's no three CPUs. That means absolutely nothing to us. And that's where we come in the 20th century, that language just falls away completely. And so therefore for Rahner, it just means three self-understandings of God, but they maintain independent enough that they're just not masks, but there are three actual self-understandings of God. While Jews, for many Jews, there are three actual aspects. You can say, you could be a more Hasidic Jew and say, I believe the Shekhinah is a real entity and Kadosh Baruch Hu is a real entity. Or you could be a good philosopher, Maimonidean. You could be a modern Jew and say it's all metaphor, it's all nice literature, but I don't have to treat it. I can treat it just as language. We don't have to put our finger on whether we take it literal or not.
Right.
We have a spectrum. I can walk into a Breslov shtibel and they can tell me I take every part literal. I can walk into a modern congregation, a progressive congregation, and I can say, oh, God has lots of faces. And it's all because it's all metaphor and literature. We don't have to put our finger on what it means. Rahner has to put his finger on what it means to say, no, there still has to be three aspects when we talk about the divine.
Okay, thank you.
But are the majority of Christians today in the 20th century view or the medieval view?
So here's our real problem, especially where you are out in Arizona. Let's deal with Protestants first. And because I said high church Protestants in my talk. Low church Protestants, like most of our evangelicals, just assume Jesus is God and don't really have this Trinitarian talk. Much of the way they talk about things that liturgically they've got a Trinity, but most of our evangelical groups in 1920 or 1940 were Unitarian. They were oneness Pentecostals. They believed in oneness, and they thought the Trinity was a Catholic idea. As time went on in the 80s, 90s, and 21st century, they went back to being creedal Trinitarians, but they don't really spend much time talking about it. Catholics, on the other hand, any official Catholic seminary, any Catholic priest, any Catholic book actually has to affirm some version of Rahner at the minimum, but like 65% of American Catholics have a rather Protestant view and don't really have much view of a Trinity, as you may know, especially as we're getting into your parts of the country out west. Here in Catholic New Jersey, in which everybody is sharpened because after being Catholic, you're then Jewish, Muslim, or Hindu, a lot of the conversation is very different. We're much more theological on this part of the country.
I mean, Jesus is the beginning and the end. It's just Jesus.
For
that bulk of Catholics that are like the evangelicals, you're saying?
No, they're going to believe. They're just not going to have an orthodox view of the Trinity, whatever they're really thinking. It just lets them. It goes right by them. They like the formula. Okay. And there's no shortage of non-Trinitarian groups that are still out there, the restoration churches and other such things that are out there in America. There is a major problem, a lot of the original categories are falling away in American populace understanding. That would be for a contemporary Protestant to think about whether they want to then revive the categories among their own laity or not. But the sort of generic, yes, we believe in the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost, and therefore they're really just God, without much distinction, but certainly no concern of what they meant historically. And certainly if you're going before a football game and saying, Jesus, help me, help our team, it's kind of lost much of the original distinctions.
Thank you so much again, Dr. Bill, for this very fascinating class. And thank you, everyone, for attending today's program. I just want to let you all know about the next class that we're having on December 11th. with Dr. Johnny Snitcher on animals as Kabbalistic masters. So I hope everyone has a great rest of their day, and we will see you next time. Bye now.